Perfect, thank you. So moving on to the meeting objectives. So the purpose of the consultation is to increase awareness on the Global Goal for Adaptation, better known as the GGA, and progress on the GGA framework in the Caribbean. Our distinguished speakers will be able to explain what the GGA is in more detail, so just bear with us before we get there. The second objective is to review and refine the draft proposal for a regional goal on adaptation for the Caribbean, the RGA, and gather feedback and views from a range of adaptation actors in the region. The document with the proposal for the RGA has been shared with participants who registered beforehand, so you should have that. For anybody who doesn't have the document, please feel free to just mention us in the chat and we can work on getting that to you. And the third objective is to build interest and commitment among relevant adaptation stakeholders, including civil society organizations, government agencies, academia, regional and international development organizations on the proposed RGA. We have two speakers with us today, Ms. Sasha Jatan Singh with, let me just make sure I have her affiliation correct. So Sasha is the loss and damage expert with Climate Analytics Caribbean, and Ms. Ainka Granderson, the senior technical officer and resilience lead for Canary. In addition, we will hopefully be able to get some opening remarks from our director at Climate Analytics Caribbean, Ms. Ruana Haynes. With that, if we can move to the next slide. Okay, so here's our agenda for the day. Oops, if we could go back one. Perfect. So here's our agenda for the day. We just went through the welcome overview and introductions. There'll be some opening remarks by our director if she's able to, as she is on the move. And then we'll pause for a quick photo op. So if we can turn our cameras on after the opening remarks, that will be great. We'll take a quick screenshot just to document that we were able to do this regional consultation and all the great participation that we have today. And then we'll move into a presentation on the GGA as well as the RGA, and we'll have some interactive discussion and Q&A. So with that, I will ask if we can pass it over to Ms. Ruana Haynes, if she's able to give us our opening remarks.
Hi, Kristen. Hi.
Perfect.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. And I really have to apologize for the background noise. I'm on the move at the moment, as Kristen said. So I'll keep it very quick. I just really wanted to be able to join you guys this morning to kick off what I think will be a really exciting discussion. So who are we as Climate Analytics? Climate Analytics is a global climate science and policy institute engaged around the world in driving and supporting climate action aligned to the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming limit. So our mission has been to connect science and policy to empower vulnerable countries in international climate negotiations and inform national planning with targeted research, analysis, and support. Climate Analytics Caribbean opened in 2021 in Trinidad and Tobago to serve the Caribbean region and to connect us really with what is happening in the international negotiations. So there are a number of gaps that we have observed, that we continue to observe between regional implementation of climate action, regional implementation of the Paris Agreement in particular, and the mission of Climate Analytics Caribbean to try to address those gaps. So in that context, we're really excited today to present to you a proposal for a draft regional goal on adaptation. The UNFCCC process under the Paris Agreement is engaged right now in a discussion on a global goal on adaptation, or at least a framework to properly implement a global goal on adaptation. The global climate change discussion has been happening for the past 30 years, and in that time, the focus has been more on mitigation action, understandably. But as climate impacts ramp up, we know that we have to cross and cover some ground on adaptation action in order to protect communities on the front line. And so that is the purpose of the global goal discussion. At the regional level, we're hoping that this proposal for a regional goal on adaptation will help us in the Caribbean to be able to strengthen our adaptation actions and also to be able to contribute to the discussion that's happening at the global level. So with that, I will leave you. Thank you very much and good luck. I hope it's a really, really great discussion. Back over to you, Kristen.
Okay. Hi, Ruana. So sorry, but you're breaking up a bit. I'm not sure if you're able to hear me. Let me know. All right. Okay, no problem.
Yes,
Thank
I can hear you. I can hear you. I'm sorry if
Perfect.
you didn't hear the last thing I said. I was just wishing you guys all the best with the discussion today. I hope you guys were able to get the majority of my remarks, but good luck with the rest of the discussion. Back over to you.
Thanks very much, Ru. We heard you very well in the end there. We just missed that last bit. So thanks very much for making the time to join us, Ru. We know you have a busy schedule, and we wish you all the luck in catching your flight. So now I will ask if we can turn our cameras on so that we can take a quick photo op. I know I'm not a fan of keeping my camera on either, but if I can beg your indulgence, that would be great. And then we'll move on to our presentations. All right. Sash, I may need to ask you to stop sharing the screen so we can get that gallery view. All right, yes, perfect. Great. Thanks, guys. Chris, are you able to take the screenshot for us? Just let us know when that's done, and then I'll pass it over to Sasha. Everybody's looking great, so glad to see all of your faces.
Okay, it's done.
Chris, I didn't smile. We need to do it again. I needed a 1, 2, 3 countdown. All right, 1, 2, 3. Chris. Great. All right, thanks very much, everyone. Cameras can go off now. I will now pass it over to Ms. Sasha Jathan Singh to present on the regional goal on adaptation for the Caribbean. Thanks, Sasha, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Kristen, and thanks to everybody for being here at this regional consultation on this draft proposal for a regional goal on adaptation for the Caribbean. And I know Ruana, provided some background as to why we're doing this from Climate Analytics Caribbean and a bit about the global goal on adaptation. So just a bit of background. The global goal on adaptation was actually established under Article 7 of the Paris Agreement with the aim of enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change with a view to contributing to sustainable development and ensuring an adequate response in the context of the temperature goal. And not much work actually was done on the GG from 2016 up until 2021, where at COP26 we established the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the GG, the GLAS, which actually the objective of that is to conceptualize, define, and ultimately operationalize the GGA, because so far it's just this aim. But how are we going to implement it? How is that going to look like? So in 2022 and 2023, the work program, the GLAS work program, has been ongoing. We've had a series of 8 workshops. The last one actually was completed last week in Botswana. you know, what has been happening there is that we've been redefining what exactly it means, what exactly this framework for this global goal on adaptation should entail, what it should look like. And why is this framework needed? You know, a GGA framework would raise the visibility of adaptation. It also invites collective evaluation of the progress of adaptation at the local, national, and regional and international levels. And it also provides, you know, political parity between mitigation and adaptation by setting a milestone comparable to the temperature goal. And it also seeks to strengthen both action and support at the local, national, and international levels. And I think that's quite important because adaptation is a priority for small island development states like here in the Caribbean. You know, adaptation is seen as a means to reduce or limit loss and damage associated with increasing adverse impacts of climate change. However, you know, the action or measures for adaptation hasn't been happening at the level that we would like it to be. And that's because there were, you know, we have adaptation needs, gaps and so on that prevent that from occurring. You know, that could be related to finance, to capacity, and also to technology transfer. And this is quite interesting because the recent adaptation gap report actually estimated that for developing countries, the adaptation gap for finance is estimated at about 202 billion US per year for this decade and growing, right? And, you know, this framework on adaptation, having this framework could really help to define what exactly are the needs, what exactly is this gap, and help to fill this adaptation gap by providing the needed support and finance to meet the required adaptation response. So you see, it's to strengthen support and action for adaptation. And I think that's why the GGA framework will really help to drive this global ambition on adaptation. And last year at COP27, there was a decision on what the elements of the GGA framework could look like, decision 3 CMA 4. And, you know, it really considers these various elements, the dimensions, which is based on the iterative adaptation policy that considers, you know, impact, vulnerability, and risk assessment, planning, implementation, and M&E and learning. Also looking at themes, which are some key adaptation sectors where adaptation action and measures take place, such as, you know, water, food and agriculture, infrastructure, health, poverty and livelihoods, ecosystems and biodiversity, and so on. And then also the GGA framework could also consider cross-cutting considerations or elements such as gender, human rights approaches, looking at intergenerational equity and social justice, also taking into consideration vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems, looking at, you know, local and traditional knowledge, nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation, disaster risk reduction. I mean, all these different cross-cutting considerations that this framework could encompass or should be incorporated. And then also looking at the sources of information for how we're going to evaluate progress on achieving, you know, the global goal on adaptation. And that could be related to, you know, it shouldn't be burdensome or onerous to developing countries to, like, what these sources of information should come from. So it could be from, you know, national adaptation plans or national communications or other reporting under other international processes, such as our reporting under the Sustainable Development Goals or under the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, for example. And with all that happening, that's the framework, and that's what the GLASS work program has been working towards, these workshops to really define what this proposed GGA framework could look like. And also the GLASS process was also informed by submissions from country groups and countries and civil society organizations and so on. And this is the position from the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, on what a proposed GGA framework could look like. And AOSIS is the country group that represents small islands and low-lying coastal states in the international climate change negotiations. And since the negotiations started, AOSIS has been very vocal, ensuring that our needs and priorities are represented at the international negotiations. So in terms of this Jamaican saying, we little but we tallow, that's how AOSIS is. We've really ensured that our views are represented and needs and priorities are represented at the international stage on climate change, because small island developing states like here in the Caribbean, we're most vulnerable and most affected by the impacts of climate change. I mean, right now, we have Tropical Storm Philippe in the basin, and it's already affected Antigua and Barbuda, and is moving up to Bermuda. We've seen, Antigua. I used to actually live there until probably a few months ago. So it's actually quite disheartening to see these are places that I used to go to visit, volunteer at, and so on. And it's been the damage and how that tropical storm has affected the country. And that being said, this is why looking at adaptation as a priority to limit loss and damage, and why a global goal and adaptation, the GGA, and a framework is so important for ensuring that adaptation action and support is adequate and provided to developing countries. And in terms of the AOSIS position, AOSIS propose various factors that should be considered in the GGA. The GGA should be inherently tied to the progress of mitigation and the temperature goal. And the GGA framework should help assess the progress and be forward-looking in indicating the source of adaptation support. So now we actually should track adaptation support and whether that is happening or not. And the key elements of what the GGA framework should focus on should be well-being for people and planet, food security, water, health, ecosystems, and infrastructure. And the AOSIS proposed 4 high-level targets for the GGA that is really grounded by Article 7.1 under the Paris Agreement, and that is enhanced prosperity. Sorry, Ulrich, go ahead.
Oh, steady state, yeah, more or less.
Okay, so
Sorry,
more or less.
Ulrich.
One day at a time.
like you're chomping on something.
Yeah, sucking a mint.
Sorry, Ulrich.
Just discovered one.
Chris, are you able to mute Ulrich?
Careful, you know.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's only a mint. Nothing more adventurous.
Oh, Ulrich,
Because
sorry.
they have these things now where I forget what you call them, that had weed and all that stuff in it. You suck it and the next thing you know you're high.
We're talking.
Hi.
Yeah.
Oh, so can I continue? It's just
Yes, I muted him.
okay,
Yeah.
thank you so much. So yeah, I guess just please mute while the presentations are taking place. And definitely when we have the Q&A and the interactive discussion, raise your hands, and we definitely want to have a very vibrant discussion on the proposed RGA moving forward. So I'll just continue with the AOSIS position. The 4 high-level targets really speak to what the AOSIS priorities are for the GGA framework would be, and that's enhanced well-being and prosperity, reduce exposure to climate-related risks, ecosystems maintained, enhanced, or restored, and also all countries have formulating and are implementing NAPs or other national adaptation policy instruments by 2030. Now, that's, all said and done, there have been a lot of challenges and complexities related to the GGA. And, one of the major ones is that the technical and political complexity that makes up the GGA process, the UNFCCC process, has been a barrier for more actors to join the conversation. And also, because adaptation is often context specific and local level, that often excludes, local communities and local CSOs and so on from contributing and informing the GGA process. And because of that, the conversation about the GGA tends to be focused on a small audience. And, it's mainly being led by negotiators, academics, and technicians. And that means that the GGA conversation and developing the framework could be disconnected from the realities that communities and CSOs actually experience on the ground. And this is why, Climate Analytics Caribbean decided to develop this proposal for a draft regional goal on adaptation for the Caribbean that has been led by civil society through the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance, particularly the Adaptation and Loss and Damage Working Group, to really form what the priorities, what the elements of this proposed regional goal on adaptation should look like. And it's really the regional goal on adaptation is really to raise the visibility of adaptation in the Caribbean and secure greater political support and buy-in for adaptation. At the local, national, and regional levels. And also having a RGA could empower Caribbean communities and local actors involved in climate action to contribute and inform the international climate change negotiations on the GGA. So it's how can we connect what is happening internationally with the underground realities, the action, the knowledge, the data, and the voices of people, of communities that are actually involved in adaptation work here in the Caribbean. And, the RGA will also capture a variety of voices and data, experiences, knowledge, and so on through engaging multiple stakeholders, and will also allow for learning and knowledge sharing and adaptation. And what's important is that the RGA can allow for the quantifying of adaptation support needs, including adaptation finance, to achieve the regional goal on adaptation, and can track progress on adaptation, action, and support here in the region. And I think that's quite important, because now we're able to quantify these are our support needs, this in terms of, let's say, climate finance. And this is what, and then we could track and report on whether this is being met or not. So I think this proposed regional goal on adaptation is quite useful. It's a useful mechanism to really help to measure progress on adaptation and to enhance climate justice or ensure climate justice for the region, as well as inform our progress on achieving the global goal on adaptation as well. And so with that, I'll end this, my presentation for now on just giving an overview of the GGA and why developing a proposed regional goal on adaptation for the Caribbean was important. So thanks so much. And you'll see me back again, don't worry. So I'll hand it over to Chris.
Thanks very much, Sasha. Really interesting information there. So now I'll pass this over to Ms. Anka Grandison, Senior Technical Officer and Resilience Lead at Canary, and she will talk about linking the Caribbean Climate Justice Agenda to the RGA. Anka, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks very much, Kristen. And thanks very much to Sasha, Ruana, and the rest of the team for coordinating this process. I think it's a really interesting and exciting process where we're trying to set our own priorities for adaptation and influence global processes. So it's really great to be part of this and to be here today. So I'll just pull up my slides so that we can get going. So for those of you who are not familiar with CANARI for some reason, so we're the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, CANARI for short. We're a regional NGO that works all across the Caribbean on stakeholder participation and stewardship of natural resources for sustainable, inclusive, and resilient development. And as Kristen said, I'm resilience lead, including leading on our work around climate justice. And so wanted to provide a little bit of context for thinking about the regional goal on adaptation for the Caribbean and some of the work that we have been doing with the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance. So I think in terms of setting that regional goal on adaptation, beyond the AOSIS, so the Alliance of Small Island States, kind of work that they have set out in terms of identifying these 4 high-level priorities, the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance, which is a network of now over 40 civil society organizations, grassroots activists, academics, persons from media, creative arts, and other non-state actors who have been coming together to talk about how can we have a shared vision and amplify our voice to really promote climate justice in the region. And as part of that, we've been working to develop a collective agenda, which is called the Caribbean Climate Justice and Resilience Agenda. And under that, we actually have some priorities around adaptation, which I think can help inform the discussion around the regional goal on adaptation. So just a little bit of background on the Alliance. So it's meant to be a regional coalition that's trying to transform policy and practice and catalyze action on climate justice. And as I just said, we're bringing together a whole host of different actors who are working on different aspects of climate justice. So from economic to environmental to social, racial, gender justice, and really to see if we can spark greater sort of change, but also really amplify the voice of the most vulnerable and the marginalized, which are not often captured in some of these larger discussions at the regional level and also at the global level. So in terms of the agenda that we've been working on and should actually have finalized to kind of launch and actually disseminate in another month or so, the goal of this agenda is really, as I had said, to offer a shared vision that's by and for Caribbean civil society and other non-state actors and really reflects our needs, priorities, and realities in the region, to really then enable us to have collective advocacy, to amplify the voices of the most vulnerable and wider civil society in the region, and to also enable collective action. So that we have a sort of shared sense of what we want to achieve and how we can do that together to promote climate justice. And so the idea is that this agenda will not only guide the work of the Alliance, but also other civil society and non-state actors across the region more broadly who are interested in endorsing it and being part of this push for climate justice. So we use a very deliberative process over actually 1.5 years to develop this agenda. And it actually contains a number of priority areas. So there's 7 priority areas. And today I'm actually going to focus in on the priority area that focuses on adaptation, because I think that's most relevant to what we're talking about here today. But we do have other sort of priorities around meeting the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature goal, around climate finance, around gender equity and justice, taking a rights-based approach, as well as just nature-based solutions and the just transition, and a cross-cutting one on youth and intergenerational equity. So there's a number of things in the agenda, but I'm going to hone in on what we're focused on around adaptation. So maybe just to give a sense of how we're thinking about adaptation in relation to the climate justice work that we're doing. So we're using this sort of broad framework to guide the work that we're doing and our thinking in terms of ensuring that there's procedural justice, that there's distributive justice, and that there's reparative or restorative justice. So what that would mean in terms of adaptation is that for procedural, we're ensuring the participation and inclusion of the most vulnerable and marginalized persons so that they're actually parts of decision-making around adaptation and being empowered to actually help themselves. In terms of distributive justice, we're looking at the fair distribution of resources so that the most vulnerable, again, and those on the front lines are actually receiving benefits from adaptation. So we're not just having big projects at the national level where we can't see any impact on the ground for the most vulnerable. And then in terms of reparative or restorative justice, the idea that we're really holding those who are responsible for climate change, the impacts, the harms that we're seeing, the loss and damage that we're seeing, so that that they are actually responsible for repairing those harms and those impacts, and therefore responsible for supporting adaptation. So this is part of our call for greater financing, which should not be considered as aid, but actually is owed to us as having contributed the least to the problem, but being on the front line of the impacts from the climate crisis. So in terms of our goal under the Caribbean Climate Justice and Resilience Agenda for Adaptation, it's about scaling up locally led solutions that meet the needs of frontline and highly vulnerable communities. So that's what we set out as a goal collectively through the work that we've been doing with the Alliance. And here's some of the priorities for action. So scaling up locally led adaptation that empowers local actors. So that includes Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant communities, others on the front lines like small-scale farmers and fisherfolk, rural women producers, to ensure that they have a voice in decisions and to design and implement the solutions. So scaling up adaptation that's locally led includes building the capacity of local actors, and that's technical and organizational capacity building, documenting and sharing the good practices and innovations so we can actually support scale up and replication of the things that we know are working well, because there is a lot of innovative stuff happening on the ground that's not necessarily being recognized and being supported. And then ensuring that any financing that we get is really grant-based, so not loans, predictable, transparent, and it's using mechanisms to actually deliver and channel those funds to the local level to meet the needs of those on the front lines, which is not really what we're seeing currently in terms of how funding mechanisms are designed. So that's one of the key priorities that we have identified. Some others are thinking about how we integrate nature-based solutions to adapt and build resilience, recognizing that investing in our ecosystems can provide multiple benefits and actually help to build not just ecological, but economic and social resilience, as our ecosystems are the basis for our very tourism-based, agriculture-based economies in the Caribbean. And there's also the co-benefits of, you're capturing carbon through conserving and restoring forests and mangroves. We also want to promote integrating Indigenous and local knowledge to support planning and decision-making, and also thinking about how we improve the entire process for land use and marine spatial planning at the community and national levels to really inform adaptation and ensure we have more resilient development. And this should really focus on water, energy, and food security, which I think are important nexus for us in the Caribbean, where we're facing significant shortages in water, lots of variability in rainfall, and lots more extremes. In terms of energy security, we know most of the islands, so I'm based in Trinidad where there's oil and gas, but most of the islands have a real sort of energy crunch and facing really high fuel prices. And there's a lot of issues around that energy security and making the transition to renewable energies. And obviously food security is a big one in terms of all of the changes we're seeing in the climate, which are impacting on how our ability to grow food, keep livestock, etc. And then we also want to talk about strengthening the linkages between social justice and environmental justice. So, the need for balance between addressing socioeconomic needs and environmental needs and ensuring sustainability and resilience with communities. And then also formalizing and strengthening mechanisms for coordination so that we really have multi-stakeholder processes that include civil society and particularly those on the front lines, so that we really have early warning, research, monitoring, and other things that actually capture the needs of those on the ground and respond to them effectively. So those are some of the priorities that we've identified through discussions with civil society. So actually several of you all who are here on the call have actually been part of these discussions where we've been trying to pull out this kind of overarching goal and some priorities that we think are really important. So I have this slide, any questions, but actually I'm going to hand over to Kristen because I'm not sure when we're going to do the Q&A as yet, but just, to give a bit of an overview of some of the work that we've been doing to try and pull out some of the key ideas around adaptation and what needs to happen for the Caribbean. So thanks for that.
Thank you very much, Anka. And apologies, I introduced you as Miss instead of Doctor. Apologies.
It's okay.
Okay, colleagues, so now we will go into a question and answer session on the information that has been presented by Sasha and Anka. So please feel free to raise your hands if you have questions or place them in the chat and I can read them out if you're unable to access your microphone at this time. Okay, so we do have one question in the chat already from Orville Gray. And he asks, what will the regional goal be tied to? Personally, if this is not tied to 1.5, then I fear this will forever be a moving target. Okay, Sasha has already responded. Sasha, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, no, definitely, Orville. Thanks for this. And the RGA definitely will be tied to the 1.5 temperature goal. And it's in keeping with the US's proposal for how the GGA framework should be defined as well. Oh, and I see Orville's hand is up. Go ahead, Orville.
Good day, everyone, and thanks for inviting me. Happy to be part of this conversation. One of the reasons why I raised that, that has been a point that we've been raising prior to the Paris Agreement, and that's part in effect why that Article 7 and 7.1 in particular is phrased the way it is, because for us as SIDS, we had pushed strongly that any goal has to be tied to the 1.5. For some of the other groups, that is not where they're coming from. And that is what's making the whole conversation challenging. But if you'll allow me, I'll also add another comment. Looking at Anka's presentation, thanks for that one, pretty on point. One of the things I'm going to say, it's probably going to be a little bit controversial here, but I think from a SIDS perspective, and particularly the Caribbean region, I don't know that our governments have done enough to target the finance mechanisms and to be able to access financing under that. While I do fully understand the rationale for pushing through for grant financing, I think unfortunately some of the structures of the projects that have been formulated just do not present themselves in the best way to access some of those mechanisms. And I think the region needs to come together to sit together versus doing it from the perspective of each country trying to get their project in and access as much as they can. But, learn from each other and figure out how to do it. I mean, just in the past couple of years, I mean, if you look at in the region and just GSAFE alone, Haiti now has, I think, 2 national projects. Barbados, I think, is 2 or 3. Grenada has 1. Antigua has 1 going on to maybe another. The rest of the region is pretty much lagging Belize has a significant pipeline already in with the GCF, but most of the other countries either have nothing or literally don't have what I would consider to be very strong enough proposals. And one of the things that we need to be doing is to actually have more concerted conversation with these climate finance mechanisms. And if we submit a proposal, as I've indicated many times, is send with it a 5-minute video presentation if you're not able to go there and present it yourself, so that they can have not just the words on paper, but the information in between, because that's where one of the big challenges in terms of financing it. There's also the big disconnect between national level financing for adaptation and local level financing for adaptation. And that is one gap that needs to be addressed in country. It can be significantly addressed through the national adaptation planning process, but it requires a significant retweaking of how we look at vertical integration, both in terms of the top-down and the bottom-up approach. And I don't know that we are having enough of those conversations. So the other fear that I have is that their targets are going to be designed, but they're not going to be helpful to us as a region or as SIDS in general. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Orville. I don't know if Sasha or Anka would like to respond.
Oh, thanks so much for that, Orville. And I definitely would like to connect with you to get more of your views on finance, adaptation finance, and how that could inform the draft proposal. And in terms of the proposal for this draft regional goal on adaptation for the Caribbean, it's focused on the 14 CARICOM countries, so the 14 CARICOM member states. So I hope that answers your question, at least the last part.
Yeah. So I would just jump in here and just say, thank you very much for that, Orville. Really appreciate it. I know that you've done a lot of work around adaptation and adaptation finance, so definitely appreciate your inputs here. And I would say that I would really reiterate and reemphasize the point you made at the beginning about tying it to the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, because I think we're not really having the conversation about the fact that there are limits to adaptation. And if we exceed 1.5 and even get towards 2 degrees Celsius, we're talking about a kind of world in which most of the adaptation measures that we're currently considering are not applicable. And so we have to be really sort of cognizant of the fact that without that work and effort to keep greenhouse emissions down and keep to that temperature goal, that all of our efforts around adaptation are actually useless unless we get very innovative and really invest in R&D, which we don't have the money to do right now.
Thanks very much, Sasha and Anka. So I am seeing some questions in the chat about where the RGA will go, but I will hold off on moving to those questions because I think some of the answers may come in the later presentations. So thanks, Sarah and Talia, for your questions. I think that the later presentations will be able to answer them, and we will have another Q&A session after the 2 presentations that will come up next where we might be able to respond to those. I see that Nicole Hendrickson has her hand up. Nicole, would you like to ask your question? You have the floor.
But more of a comment and a question, just following off of the person who preceded me. A lot of the people who are going to be impacted by this whole climate shift are people who don't know. I was part of a small process to deal with the Trinidad adaptation outside of an environmental context, from an HIV perspective and an SRH perspective, which is how I got into this whole climate change stuff. And it just seems as if it's an additional something for persons who already work in areas that dealing with the majority of the world's ills is something to think about. And because of the fact that there is that doom and gloom talk that we can't get away from, I think people have not made a decision to incorporate it. I think they are willing to say, well, that is a ways off, that is not going to impact me. But for those of us living in the region right now, we know that this, because of yesterday, we have a warning that we're going to have a heat spell for the rest of the month. That has impacted everybody at different levels. So to say that it's a ways off is putting on blinders and is making the decision to be obtuse, to be honest. But I think how do we then get to people who are in the spaces, specifically CSO spaces, to say, how can we assist in you talking about these particular important things and maybe make it align with what you're already doing? So from an HIV perspective, somebody's mic is open. From an HIV perspective, the heat impacts persons. From an SRH perspective, it impacts persons who become pregnant in terms to the point where stillborns happen. So I think just how we language it and how we present it may get more persons involved, because I think it's still a conversation around environmentalists and we need everybody on board.
Great, thank you very much for that, Nicole. Colleagues, are there any other questions, any other persons that would like to raise their hands? Sarah, Talia, Lauren, I'm not ignoring your questions. It's just that I do know that Sasha will touch on the responses to some of your questions in her next presentation. So I promise we will get to them. Quincy asks, what about the collaboration with regional organizations such as the MRV Hub?
Yeah, definitely. What we've presented, or what we're presenting right now, is a proposal for a regional goal on adaptation for the Caribbean. And we need inputs from, stakeholders and so on how this is going to move forward. How is it going to be implemented? Looking at endorsement, where is it going to be housed? What about finance? And so, to ensure that this RGA is being implemented and we're tracking progress of it. So definitely we could look at we're open to collaboration with all regional organizations, including the MRV process. And so we're open to any suggestions from you all on possible collaborations for bringing the RGA to fruition.
Thanks very much, Sasha. All right, I will give just 2 more minutes as we are ahead of time in case any other burning questions come up. Okay, so Kadeen asks, is there a way to incentivize governments to take action by tying this work to existing efforts? Sasha or Ainka?
So in terms of this proposal for a regional goal on adaptation this is our aspirational goal for what adaptation should look like for the Caribbean. So it looks at what's happening right now and what are the needs and priorities to ramp up adaptation work. So in addition to holding Caribbean governments to task, and it's coming from on the ground actors, from civil society, from communities, saying these are our priorities, these are our needs, and so on addressed. And at the same time, we're tracking progress on adaptation action, but then we're also tracking progress on adaptation support, so finance, capacity building, and so forth, that reaches on the ground for the appropriate adaptation responses to take place. So I think having a RGA in existence and being implemented could be a means to really to do that, right? So it's not just us going to the international community saying we need more funding, we need more capacity building, and so on, but we're actually aligning. This is where the gaps are. This is where the needs are. This is the work that's happening right now in terms of adaptation. And these are the most vulnerable regions or communities or peoples that we want to address. So I think it's quite useful. Yep. And I think since I'm seeing a lot of the questions and comments coming in, we could probably start onto the other presentations, because I guess we could answer some of these questions might be answered from the preceding the following presentation. Sorry.
So just a quick comment on the question, which I think is a really great one. So I think with a broader group of people, we've been thinking about how to hold people to account. And there have been some discussions about thinking about having some targets written into the NDCs. So if we have a goal that, you have to develop a national adaptation plan, maybe also require that at least some of the really big key targets are also in the NDCs, which I think there is a lot more effort to hold people to account to than the NAPs in general, because most people don't have NAPs, and it's because nobody's expecting you to have a NAP. There's no mandate or anything for that. And a lot of people are not doing their NatComs, which are the national communications around the NAPs and the adaptation stuff. So that's one kind of way that we can think about holding them to account, and maybe something to think about writing in to the RGA.
Great. Thanks very much, Sasha and Anka. Kadeen, I'm not sure if you wanted to take the floor. Did you?
I was writing a comment, so I guess I can just talk about it. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think I'm learning more about the specific Caribbean context, because that is not my field right now. But I'm wondering what Caribbean governments are prioritizing, whether they're thinking about energy or food security or something like that, and if there's a way to show them through data how climate does impact these things that are maybe not seemingly immediately related. Because the idea that climate doesn't impact us yet, or isn't going to be something we need to think about in a year or 5 years, is actually not true. So that's kind of why I was asking the question: what are people prioritizing, and how do we show that climate does impact exactly what they are working on? But I'm learning more, so totally happy just to listen as everyone else asks questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Kadeen. Well noted. So I will take one last question, and I see Ulrich's hand is up, so I'll pass to Ulrich, and then we'll move on to the next session. Ulrich, you have the floor.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to comment on what my old colleague Orville said a short while ago. Don't underrate one of the biggest challenges we have in the region is basically putting in place the proposals for funding. And unfortunately, we have countries struggling on their own to do that. And I think a need in the region is for us to develop some sort of regional support mechanism that will help countries to put the different proposals together. For a group for water, a group for health, a group for agriculture, etc., so that this pool of expertise can move around and expedite the whole process. It's not an easy task. That's one of our biggest challenges, basically, to get our proposals in the form that would more or less satisfy the requirements of the different funding agencies. All right.
Thanks very much, Dr. Trutz. So I will now pass the floor back over to Sasha, where she will present an overview of the key elements of the proposed RGA, and then we'll have an interactive discussion on the proposed RGA. And I think that some of the questions that are coming up will be able to be answered from this presentation. So Sasha, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks so much. And thanks so much, Dr. Trotz, for providing your feedback on the need for improved systems for accessing climate finance through developing better proposals for the region. And I know that's something that Orville has indicated before, and it's how do we get these systems in place so we're able to access this quickly and not wait for 5 years refining proposals under the GCF. And it's basically, similar. It's the needs and the priorities are the same if it's water, if it's coastal infrastructure and so forth. So we shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel, but we should build on what has worked well for other Caribbean countries. So I think moving forward, I'll present on the proposed elements of the regional goal and adaptation, and just a bit on what the approach and key findings for developing this proposed RGA was about. Climate Analytics Caribbean undertook a participatory and consultative process to develop this proposed RGA over the period June to October, and it's still taken place. It has been a civil society-led and bottom-up approach, and definitely has been informed by the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance. The members there have inputted and provided really good inputs and insights into what the priorities and what the elements of this proposed RGA should look like. Methods included a desktop review focusing on the nationally determined contributions, the national adaptation plans, also national climate change related policies, strategies, and plans. And also, focus groups, interviews, and consultations such as these. And in terms of some of the key findings with regards to adaptation goals and targets and so on in the Caribbean, what we found based on the desktop review is that Caribbean countries generally have adaptation goals and so on that are largely process-oriented and capacity-building focused rather than outcome focused. So, focusing on process and capacity building really enables countries to enhance, data collection systems and processes to better assess what are the climate risks and develop suitable strategies and plans to respond to climate risk and vulnerability more effectively. So it's similar to what I think Dr. Trotz has stated, that we need to get the systems in place to ensure that we have we're able to access and develop proper proposals for accessing the adaptation finance. So similarly, we need to improve how we collect data, how we'll be able to have conduct vulnerability and risk assessments and so on before we could start looking at outcomes. So how can we address the impacts of climate change? So we need to get this done first. So I thought that was quite useful, that a lot of the goals and targets are focused on process and capacity building for Caribbean SIDS. Then also in terms of what the adaptation priorities, challenges, and considerations for the Caribbean should are, and this is really informed by the Adaptation and Loss and Damage Working Group of the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance, in addition to the desktop review of the various policies and plans and so on. And the priority sectors that came out were food security and agriculture, including fisheries, water, ecosystems and biodiversity, poverty and livelihoods, health, cities and infrastructure, and energy. And energy came up mainly from the review of the NDCs and the NAPs, and not from discussions with CSOs. But I thought it was useful to include that. It's bracketed. So it could be included, or it could be excluded just based on discussion here. And I think that's important looking at in terms of when countries in the Caribbean talk about energy as a adaptation measure, they talk about energy resilience, and transitioning to renewable energy as a resilience measure. In terms of what were the major adaptation challenges or constraints facing the Caribbean, definitely looking at issues with data collection, analysis, and research, capacity issues, also, issues with access and availability of climate finance, and especially finance that goes down to the local and community levels, top-down approaches rather than bottom-up approaches, limited public awareness and education on adaptation, lack of political will on adaptation, little or no economic incentives for adaptation action, limited access to technology and expertise, and also limited engagement and participation of local communities and CSOs on adaptation planning, implementation, and M&E. And this is quite useful because it'll help frame out, this is what the elements of the proposed regional goal on adaptation should focus on or look like. Then also some of the key considerations or principles for the proposed regional goal includes, was definitely informed by the climate justice and resilience agenda that Ainka spoke about, as well as from the Climate Justice Alliance and the desktop review. And some of the key considerations include locally led adaptation. The RGA should be people-centered, just and transformative, a focus on grant-based climate finance that is decentralized and accessible to local communities and civil society involved in adaptation, focusing on people over profit, devolved decision-making, gender equity, justice and social inclusion, a whole of society approach, intergenerational equity, rights-based approaches, nature-based solutions. And I think something that's quite important was just based on the focus group that we had in July with the Adaptation and Loss and Damage Working Group. It was this consideration that we need to meet the needs of local communities and most vulnerable groups first through adaptation solutions. And that should frame or guide how we view the RGA, and we measure progress on meeting the RGA. Then also community and local ownership and support, and also building local socioeconomic resilience and supporting economic diversification. And these were some of the considerations that that were identified as what the proposed RGA should incorporate, which was, it's a lot and very ambitious, but I think it's important to raise that and incorporate as best as we could. And also the proposed RGA was aligned to international processes taking place on the GGA. And I spoke about the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program and the inputs and outcomes and activities from the Glasgow program inform the framework and elements of the proposed RGA. And that includes, relevant decisions such as Decision 3, CMA 4 on the elements of the GGA framework, summary reports of the various GLASS workshops, and also submissions to the GLASS process, such as the AOSIS proposal, which I discussed previously. And then from that, I think we could go on to the proposal for a regional goal and adaptation for the Caribbean. And I have shared that with you all with the meeting documents, and I also put it in the chat as well. So for those of you who haven't yet gotten a chance to review it, please do, and also feel free to provide comments and feedback directly in that document. We will be taking that into consideration and refining the proposed RGA. And with that being said, the purpose of the RGA, so it really offers an aspirational vision of what adaptation success could look like for the Caribbean, and reflects the needs, priorities, and realities for adaptation in the region. And the purpose is to raise the visibility of adaptation in the Caribbean, quantify and fill adaptation gaps and needs, including finance, capacity, and technical assistance, and enable collective review of progress on adaptation through more effective climate governance processes and practical adaptation actions at the local, national, and regional levels. And I think here, because I'm discussing the proposal, I would like it to be an interactive discussion. So if it is you have comments or feedback or suggestions on how to improve this proposed regional goal on adaptation, feel free. I think just based on what was what was proposed by Orville, is that we need to tie any sort of regional goal on adaptation to the temperature goal, 1.5 temperature goal. And I think that would be a good suggestion to include that in this purpose here. So we know that we have that link, and we have something to make sure that we're measuring progress by. Then in terms of the guiding principles for this proposed RGA, the RGA it's enabling people-centered, just, and transformative solutions, sorry about that, focusing on locally led adaptation, ensuring participatory and inclusive climate governance processes, advancing gender equity, justice, and social inclusion, ensuring a whole of society approach, particularly through meeting the needs of the most vulnerable groups and communities first, emphasizing rights-based approaches, advancing ecosystem-based approaches and nature-based solutions, enabling community-based adaptation, local ownership and support, and increasing socioeconomic resilience and supporting economic and livelihood opportunities. So if anybody has any comments or feedback on these guiding principles, feel free to message in the chat, provide comments and suggestions in the document as well. You could also raise your hand if you wish. I'll ask Kristen to help moderate that, because I can't see anybody right now. In terms of the vision for the proposed RGA, it's a strong and resilient Caribbean where our people, livelihoods, and ecosystems are prosperous, healthy, and thriving through accelerated adaptation, action, and support, and climate resilient development that reduces climate risk, strengthens resilience, and enhances adaptive capacity. And I wanted to, some of the questions that I have for this proposed vision is that, is this suitable? Should we have a time frame, for example? Should we incorporate the temperature goal here? So these are some questions, I'm just throwing out at you guys, and you could feel free to respond and provide your suggestions. I don't know if we have any hands up.
I saw Talia's hand up. I'm not sure. It's lowered now, so I'm not sure if she wants to come in. So, but if you do, Talia, feel free.
Hi, sorry. It's because I'm driving and I wasn't sure if I could talk. I have just one comment. I got the opportunity to listen to PM Mia Motley's speech recently at the UN General Assembly. And she mentioned the term and the word reparatory justice. And I think it's something, especially I noted we have some people who have social cause backgrounds. I think we need to do a better job at tying the social causes, the social implications, and social impact in the region. And maybe somehow see if we could figure out if we could get financing also through reparatory justice. And that was my comment.
Thanks very much, Talia. Sasha?
Thanks for that, Talia. And thanks for looking at that term and how do we incorporate that term and what that means, reparatory justice, in this proposed regional goal for adaptation. So that will be considered as well. Any other comments or anything from the chat so far? If not, I can move on. So these are the 4 proposed targets for the regional goal and adaptation, and it's really informed by the high-level targets under the AOSIS submission. So I'm putting this forward just based on it's informed by discussions, by desktop review, by inputs from various CSOs and so on in the region. But I want to know, are these targets relevant? Should we use the proposed AOSIS targets? It's been guided by that, or should we develop new ones? And I also included some sub-targets. And in terms of the time frame, I put it to 2030, since it's really looking at process-oriented outcomes. So you want to definitely build the capacity and the systems and so on, have that in place before we could really start looking at looking at outcomes, adaptation outcomes. How do we measure that? So making sure we get the finance and capacity and so on in place first. Is that relevant? Is it not relevant? Does anybody have any other suggestions? And I know it's very difficult to put people on the spot, so you all could feel free to provide comments and suggestions in the document, the Google, I send the Google link. And I'll resend it again to people. So the first proposed target is enhance well-being and prosperity of Caribbean countries through improving access, availability, and quality of water, food, we put energy in brackets, and healthcare for the most vulnerable people and communities by 2030. And some of the targets are by 2030, 60% of the most vulnerable groups and communities in Caribbean country have increased access to availability and quality of the national water supply. And I know we're talking about water here, but one of the questions is, should we only focus on the national water supply? What about people who can't access or don't have regular access to the water supply and they have to use other means such as rainwater harvesting, for example? Should it be broader than that? And then also things to think about. If you have comments and so on, that's fine. Let me know. Enhance, the other sub-target is enhance food security, nutrition, availability, and quality in the agriculture and fisheries sectors through appropriate adaptation measures and adaptation support in the Caribbean by 2030 for 60% of the most vulnerable groups and communities. Does that make sense? You know, what I'm saying is we need to enhance food security and nutrition in these sectors, and it has to reach the most vulnerable groups and communities. And I put 60% because we needed a target. And I focused on the most vulnerable groups and communities just based on that one of the guiding principles where we have to meet the needs of the most vulnerable in society first, rather than trying to address everybody. And that's where we could see the most impact for adaptation action. So it's something to think about. If you have any comments and so on, feel free. The bracketed target is on energy. So it's increase energy security, access, and resilience through enabling the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy by 2030 for 60% of the most vulnerable groups and communities in Caribbean countries. So this is a suggestion. So we could decide if we want to include energy or not here. And then also the last sub-target is on health, and it's improved access to and provision of healthcare services for climate-related illnesses for the most vulnerable groups and communities through ensuring that 100% of critical health infrastructure is climate resilient by 2030. And I put that here because it was really measuring, like looking at this, we had these suitable systems in place. So in case there is any sort of climate disaster, tropical storm or hurricane and so on, our healthcare facilities could be up and running. For example, we have access to, they have access to water and energy. So they're not down after or during a extreme weather event, for example. So at least the healthcare services will be available. So that was my reasoning for that. Yep.
Thanks very much, Sasha. Just to pause because I'm seeing some activity in the chat. I am seeing some comments with regard to how we might go about implementing targets and measuring them. And I imagine that we'll have a discussion on that as you go through the rest of the proposed targets. But I do have a question from Cindy. Hi, Cindy, asking how the percentages were determined. Would you be able to respond?
Yeah, sure. So the percentages was basically people saying more than 50%, but it's up to us to decide what the targets were. I put 60, right? But is that appropriate? Is it realistic? What do you think these targets should be? And I put 2030, but that's I would say it's just a marker, a place marker. It could change. I thought 2030 might be useful because that's, that will inform the next rounds of NDC updates and so on. So if you have any comments and suggestions, let me know. And yeah, go ahead. If there are any comments, we have 3 other targets, but I think I want to have an interactive discussion. So Chris, you could go ahead
Yeah, I'm seeing Orville has his hand up, and then there's a comment from Lauren in the chat. So what I'll do is I'll pass to Orville, then we can pick up the comment from Lauren and see if Cindy wanted to respond. Orville, you have the floor.
Thanks again. And yeah, I mean, the thought was running in my mind when I saw Cindy typed it as well. So it's, hi, Cindy. Definitely something to note. I think, you know, in terms of coming up with these targets and dates, it has to be tied to what it is that we as a region have communicated, whether it be through SDGs, national, whether there's any relevant national strategies, adaptation plans, NDCs, or any other strategic document. It has to be tied to something that is realistic and achievable, something that we have been communicating as governments with across the region in how we're going to do it. So, you know, for me, this 60% has to be somewhat of a, I guess, an average or something realistic that is coming out from each country, so that we don't end up in a situation where we're looking at trying to meet a target that is just unachievable or only achievable for a handful of countries. And then in terms of the time frame, you know, should this be, for instance, a graduated time frame where, you know, there are certain countries that we expect should be able to meet this target by X date, while there are other countries that we know will take a lot longer. I mean, for instance, when you look at something like this, how does it translate on the ground for a country like Haiti, Suriname, or Belize? You know, what does that look like? How does this factor in, especially on the energy side of it, when you look at countries like Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad? So these numbers to me have to be realistic. Otherwise, I think we're just going to look at them and ignore them because we just don't know how grounded they can be. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Orville. And definitely we'll thank you for your comments on how we should look at framing these targets. And that definitely should be tied to you know, national reports and documents or strategies where countries provide targets and so on. We did review the NDCs and the NAPs and some national plans and policies and so on, but we could broaden it to look at, you know, SDGs and so on to see what is, you know, what is included. And then I think looking at a graduated time frame, just based on the very national circumstances of different countries would be quite useful. So thank you for that suggestion as well.
Great, thanks very much. I see that Cindy has her hand up, and I think it's also on this topic. So Cindy, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kristen, and good morning. It's still morning in the Caribbean. Good morning, everyone. And thanks for having me here. It's good that I'm coming in right after Orville, because he said some of the things that I was gonna point out. But I also noted that in the chat, Linda, who has been one of our experts that we've relied on in the past on this topic, has noted that we should also be cognizant of the targets or the thinking about targets at the international level in relation to what's being proposed here. So I'm just reiterating what Linda has already said in the chat. But in relation to the percentages that you have proposed, I see where you're coming from, Sasha. You put these down just to sort of get us thinking and maybe advise or tell you that this doesn't work or whatever. So I support what Orville said in that these things definitely need to be aligned to what countries have already articulated, and many of them have articulated things in their NAPs, NDCs, and even other instruments in the Caribbean. I want to add a point on that because once we put a number, and whatever that number may be, it means that we also expect through some modality that these will be tracked and reported against. And I would, strongly suggest that, it also be aligned to how we expect that reviewing progress and tracking will be done at the international level as well, because we've been saying we don't want to add additional burdens to capacity constrained SIDS, right? And that also applies to the Caribbean. So when we put these numbers down, where are we going to derive the information to report against these? So as Orville is saying, countries have articulated things, and obviously some of those things or most of those things are based on their own understanding and assessment of what they have data and information to report on, and so on. So we want to keep that in mind in terms of settling on particular figures, if I can call them that. I also want to maybe add a little bit more in terms of the numbers, but the specific sub-targets being set under the sort of 4 targets we've outlined and which are aligned with the position of AUSIS, the whole set of SIDS. The targets, we've not articulated targets which could disadvantage populations. So when we say 60%, for example, in A, of the most vulnerable groups and communities in Caribbean countries, you know, this is one example, but you've got similar figures across the board. We want to not put anything down that, you know, let's say it could be achieved, and this is very trying to simplify, that could be achieved, and, you know, a box could be checked and say, yes, the Caribbean has done something, whether it's 60% or 20% or whatever. But, you know, large parts of these groups are left unattended or not receiving the attention and support that is needed to, you know, enhance their well-being and prosperity, right? So we just want to be cognizant of that when we think about particular targets. So I think I made 3 points so far, and I'll stop there for now. I see other people are making comments in the chat.
Thanks very much for that, Cindy. Sasha, before I pass it back to you, I just want to give a little heads up of what's happening in the chat. So I'm seeing some support for including the energy security target and some discussion around that. So I don't know if you would like to pick that up as well. And of course, there are questions in terms of how we are going to measure all of this, what data, what baselines we will use, what data exists. And I think that discussion will come up as well as you move through these slides. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, and you feel free to let me know how you'd like to move forward.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Kristen, and thanks for that, Cindy. I think those comments are quite useful. And as I said, these were just, I would say, place markers and suggestions based on discussions for what the targets should look like, the timeframes and so on. But understanding the thinking and not disadvantaging countries and populations, vulnerable populations, is quite useful. And it shouldn't just be that we tick a box, but we want to see that actual progress is being made. So thank you for those comments, and we will take that into consideration in how we refine it. So if it is that we don't include, you know, a actual percentage, or if you have any suggestions on how to frame it, that would be quite useful. In terms of how these, I know everybody's talking about how it's going to be measured and so on. And this is really, and indicators and so on. And we don't want it to be burdensome for it. So I think it'll be useful to include, and I didn't include it, a section on reporting and M&A and so on. And these are just proposed, and where the sources of information for tracking progress could come from. And that would be based on suggestions from Orville and Cindy on, you know, existing NDCs and NAPs and ADCOMs and so on, but other processes and other proposals. So this data is there. And the indicators should be there and be based on what is appropriate for the region and for countries as well, right? And that's a discussion. I mean, these are targets and high-level targets. And I think the framework for the GGA, trying to get down to indicators is quite technical and quite complex. So I think it's useful to look at the targets and are these achievable, and then what sorts of information is needed, rather than going down to the level of indicators as yet. Because I think and to just know, is this achievable, what sort of information we need, and how is it going to be measured, just high level questions before we get down to the nitty-gritty of what are some of the indicators, because I think that's a whole different discussion that we'll need. But thank you for raising those points and thinking about that. I like where this is going. I'm seeing that people are interested in this. Is not just a proposal. We could actually implement it and how it's being implemented. So I like that people are thinking and forward thinking on this. So I guess we could move on to the next proposed target. And this is on reduce exposure to climate-related risks from extreme weather and climate events for 50%. Now that's, as I say, a place marker of each Caribbean country's total population by reducing the number of people affected, particularly the most vulnerable groups and communities, by 2030. And a lot of these sub-targets are really focused on improving existing processes and systems. One of the sub-targets is all Caribbean countries have carried out climate risk and vulnerability assessments and put in place early warning systems and climate information services by 2030. Is that achievable? Has that already been done, for example? What is the process? These are things we were thinking about. And then the other sub-target, by 2030, all Caribbean countries have ensured that 100% of critical government and emergency facilities and services, including education, agriculture, health, water, power generation, and security, are climate resilient and are fully functional during and after extreme weather and climate events. And this is just this was based on discussions and from NDC targets and so on, where we want to ensure after governments have stated after extreme climate event, they want to make sure that critical services are functional to serve the population. So I thought that was useful to incorporate. Then another sub-target, by 2030, 100% of public infrastructure and buildings are fully compliant with climate resilient building codes in the Caribbean. And then by 2030, 50% of the most vulnerable groups and communities have increased social and economic resilience through improved access to nationally appropriate social protection systems and increased livelihood and economic opportunities through enhanced, and I put in brackets, locally led adaptation measures in Caribbean countries. So I know that's a mouthful, but it was really looking at how do we improve our existing systems and structures in terms of looking at climate information and data and undertaking climate risk and vulnerability assessments and so forth, and then making sure that critical services can be functional, and also ensuring that vulnerable groups and communities have improved economic and social opportunities through adaptation measures. So I'll ask Kristen to see if there are any comments or questions.
Not seeing any on this particular slide, but Nikita did suggest that for the percentages we can include at least before to make them less specific.
Yeah.
And I am seeing that Candace just raised her hand. So Candace, feel free to ask a question.
Hi, thanks. And I think my question really, or comment really has to do with some of these sub-targets. And just wondering in terms of how realistic or how do we get to that place? Do we need to step back a little bit too and look at, for example, if we look at C, really first understanding or making sure that there are actually climate resilient building codes before we say we're going to ask people to get 100% of the infrastructure and buildings compliant with it. Similarly for B, you know, is it that people have identified what encompasses critical infrastructure, facilities, or services for them as a first step before getting to the point of ensuring that everything is, you know, climate resilient. So I don't know if that's assumed that that would be part of getting to, you know, that indicator, or if we should be more explicit in bringing out those parts of it. That is it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Candace. And so as I said, 100% and so on, these were just place markers. And so I like that people are thinking about, is this realistic? Is this, you know, can we do this? Is it adequate? Should we be more reasonable? Also, are these targets that have been, you know, suggested or proposed by Caribbean governments, for example? So I do like that conversation and that thinking. And in terms of so these targets are broad, and when I talk about terms like climate resilience, infrastructure, and so on, that's up to Caribbean countries to decide or define what this means for them. So it's not us being prescriptive at all, but just and they have you know, countries in the NECs and NAPs and so on, they have stated, you know, climate resilient infrastructures and so on. So they've been thinking about it, they've proposed it, but it hasn't been defined as yet. So definitely we could look at how to refine these targets to ensure that it's aligned with I guess what is happening in the region in terms of building codes, for example, and looking at also if there are any explicit targets for countries, and should it be 100% or should it be another figure, for example, at least 50%, for example. Yep. I hope that helps. Any other questions on this this target and sub-targets?
Thanks, Asha. So I'm seeing one additional question in the chat, but I just want to give you a heads up that we have about 20 minutes left, just so you know how we can move forward. So the question in the chat is with regard to sub-target C, and Myra says she's very interested in how it's going to work with being a UNESCO World Heritage Site, if that's the case. So that's just one question / comment that's in the chat.
So thanks for that. I can't really, I think I'll need more information about it, but as I said, these are so these targets, it's up to the Caribbean countries to determine what they mean by climate resilience, for example. I do know that we've been doing work on CARICOM to develop a regional building code. I don't know, I have to follow up on that status. Will they utilize that? Or I know countries have been updating their building codes to make it climate resilient within the Caribbean as well. Could utilize that as well. So it's broad, and we can definitely look at other codes and guidelines and so on as well. So we have 2 more proposed targets. So I'll just move on to the next one. And this one is really focused on ecosystems and biodiversity. So all Caribbean countries have ensured that coastal, ocean, freshwater, and terrestrial ecosystems are maintained, enhanced, or restored by protecting at least 30% of the land and ocean by 2030. And this 30 by 30 isn't a new thing. I think under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and so on, these are commitments that have already been proposed and so on. And some of these sub-targets are By 2030, there is 50% increased coverage of healthy coral reefs, seagrass beds, and other important ecosystems to support increased fish stocks and protect coastlines and livelihoods for Caribbean countries. Another sub-target is by 2030, all Caribbean countries have updated or established national policies and plans for the establishment of special conservation, protected and management areas for critically important coastal, ocean, freshwater, and terrestrial ecosystems. And finally, all Caribbean countries have implemented locally led adaptation measures that include climate smart practices and ecosystem-based approaches to increase the resilience and adaptive capacity of critically important ecosystems by 2030. So any comments and questions about that? I know I did get a comment from Tanya that for C, we could say all countries have already been implementing locally led adaptation measures, right? So we'd have to improve that or refine that target to say it has enhanced or increased the implementation of locally led adaptation measures, for example. So it's how do we refine these targets to really reflect what it is we're trying to say and what it is we want to happen in terms of adaptation in the Caribbean. So we want to increase adaptation action and we want to increase the support for it to make sure that we have the successful adaptation outcomes in the Caribbean. And I put, as I said, these percentages are place markers. So any comments or questions on this target?
Thanks, Sasha. Not seeing any particular or specific comments or questions on this target, but there is a comment in the chat that we may need some definitions. Anka, you have your hand up. Anka, you have the floor.
Hi, thanks, Kristen. So as I was reading through the target, I just had a thought. So for the 3C sub-target, it might be more useful to think about wording it to promote governance mechanisms or structures that support participatory or co-management of these spaces, because I think that's kind of what we're actually trying to achieve. We want it to be a more decentralized, locally led approach that is trying to include these climate smart practices and ecosystem-based approaches. And so it may not necessarily just be that we want locally led adaptation measures, but we want to create a structure that actually enables that participatory, locally led management of these key ecosystems. And through the work Canary and many others are doing, we know that many CSOs are co-managing very important ecosystems across the region and contributing significantly. And so I think making sure that there's something referring to that would be useful.
No, thanks for that, Anka. I took some notes, but if you could share that, like if you have any proposal or suggestions for how we could incorporate it. And so we will capture the fact that, CSOs and communities have already been engaging in co-management of critically important ecosystems and habitats already. And, right, like this week we had stories from the BBC and CNN on Redonda Island and the work that the Environmental Awareness Group in Antigua and Barbuda has been doing to really restore that island from it being completely barren and overrun by rats and so on to being just viable and having a thriving ecosystem and populations of critically endangered species and so on there. So I think that's something to consider when we're framing this target on focusing on enabling more participatory governance structures and so on for co-management, which will enable more locally led adaptation measures rather than just stating that it's been implemented. Thank you. And I definitely will incorporate that when we're refining these sub-targets.
Great. Thanks, Sasha. Thanks, Anka. There are some additional suggestions that are being placed in the chat. So everybody, please know that we are noting your suggestions, and we'll be saving the chat. So anything that you post in the chat, we'll be able to come back to later as we refine the RGA. Sasha, I'm not sure how you want to proceed, but we have about 15 minutes left. And I know you wanted to have a discussion on number 4 and next steps.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I'll just go on to the next, to the 4th proposal and we could have the discussion, or so I'll just continue with the last target and then what the next steps are, and we could just open it up for discussion. So then I could actually see the chat, because I don't have to have my screen. I don't have to share my screen. So the last target is really focusing on improving our adaptation planning processes and so on. So improving our processes, basically. So by 2030, all Caribbean countries have established inclusive and transparent adaptation planning processes, have developed and are implementing national adaptation plans and policies, and have mainstream adaptation in their development strategies to reduce vulnerability and exposure to climate-related risks for the most vulnerable groups and communities. And the sub-targets are that all Caribbean countries have developed and are implementing their national adaptation plans through inclusive and participatory climate governance processes that enhances ownership and support of local communities and the most vulnerable groups by 2030. Next sub-target is by 2030, all Caribbean countries have improved access to international climate finance and adaptation support to develop and implement their NAPs and other national adaptation policies and plans. And the last one is by 2030, all Caribbean countries have increased access and availability of grant-based adaptation finance to local communities and CSOs through the establishment and implementation of decentralized financing mechanisms to support locally led and community-based practical adaptation actions. So I know this is the target that discusses finance and support and so on. So I think it's useful to get comments and views on how to refine this. And I know we did have some discussion and some comments and questions about finance and support. So the floor is open for any questions or comments and so on.
While we're waiting for folks to raise their hand on this one, I just wanted to acknowledge that Sarah has included some suggestions in the chat as well for the last couple of slides, which I think are very helpful. So thanks very much, Sarah. And I don't know if I'm saying it right, if it's Sarah or Sarah, but thank you.
So I think for sub-target 4C, when we're speaking about increased access and availability of grant-based adaptation finance, and this is really to ensure to local communities and CSOs, this is to ensure that the adaptation finance is actually flowing down to the actors and the communities and people that need it and are engaging in adaptation action and measures. So because I know Orville and had stated that a lot of climate finance and so on, and a lot of the projects that countries have submitted proposals for and they've gotten funding for, the adaptation finance doesn't actually go to the communities and to the actual actions on the ground. It's caught up in other processes, administrative capacity building, whatever you want to call it. So this was a means to ensure that the money, the finance goes to on the ground action to the communities and CSOs and organizations that are actually doing the work. And it was through, looking at decentralized financing mechanisms to support this type of work. So they don't have to be the ones applying to the Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund and so on, for example, but they're able to access this money to do the work that they're already doing or expand on the work or enhance it. So that was the thinking around this the sub-targets.
Thanks, Sasha. I think we have a good suggestion from Anchor in the chat. She suggests that we include climate finance targets as a separate fifth target, and then keep this one on adaptation planning and policies.
Okay, that sounds great. And then I could, break it down a bit more. So thanks for that suggestion. So any other comments and so on?
Yes, Sandra Ferguson here from Grenada. I'm sorry I can't find mine. Put up your hand for the chat.
That's fine, Sandra.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Okay, I just have a few general comments. Some of my concerns are kind of implied in some of the comments that have already gone down. However, the issue of definitions, I think, is very important. In fact, I was quite surprised because when I look at most of this language doesn't sound very CSO to me. Sounds, anyway, some of what I'm seeing there. So for example, when you have in your vision, prosperous, you show that we as CSOs and when the authorities see that we're talking about the same thing, are we speaking about the same thing? On the issue, I was quite surprised, not surprised, but reference, Mr. Gray expressed concern about the fact that governments are not applying for finance, grant-based finance with for adaptation, etc. I would like to also say that governments, in fact, are even violating the policies, really some policies and regulations in place. And technical advice, strong technical advice is being superseded by ministerial and certain political authority, which is creating more problems. And debt as well in some cases. And Ainka mentioned the relationship to the 1.5, which is very important. I think we have to see all of these things as being interrelated. So when we are raising areas in the name of prosperity development, and I think Sarah made a comment in relation to that, we must look at how it affects the whole, because all of these things are interrelated. So we talk about the issue of locally based adaptation, great, and we all support that. But we must also be aware that national policies undo the good we are doing on the ground. So that is important. That is extremely important. Because in some senses, we are in fact destroying certain natural resources that are going to improve our resilience and enhance our resilience. And I don't know if I got it wrong, but I did hear the issue of climate resilience to be defined. Yes, and at least as a CSO sector, when we say climate resilience, we must all be clear that we are on the same page, talking, saying the same thing, and meaning the same thing. Climate resilience cannot be left to the whims and fancies of individual governments. On the issue of ISO healthcare services and impact, while important, I may probably want to couch that in the whole issue of health systems, and then we can further break down the targets and so on. And the whole issue, I don't think, did I see wellness? I don't know if it was, I put it in when I was in some comments. But he had well-being, did have well-being, he had prosperity, and he had access to health care. But I wonder if at that level we ought to be talking about wellness. And the issue of food security also has to have issues like safety and sovereignty. I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sandra, for those comments. And I'll definitely note your comments on including issues like food safety and sovereignty in the targets and looking at the health sub-targets as well. And in terms of the definitions, I didn't include definitions there. I thought that is a discussion because we can't be prescriptive on what we think these definitions should be. I think it's up to countries and CSOs and so on to determine what these things mean. But I do agree with you that we need to have some guidance to improve understanding on specific highly important themes such as climate resilience, what does adaptation finance mean, and so on as well. So I do take that, and I will incorporate a section on definitions that in the draft technical paper, and it will be open for comments and reviews to really improve and refine that on what these definitions are, and it's coming from Caribbean civil society. So thank you for your comments, Sandra. I think those were well noted. And
Thanks, Ash.
Yeah, and I think moving on, I know
Yeah.
we have a few minutes left, but I just want to move on to the sorry. I think we did the interactive discussion, and I think this was quite useful in terms of the next steps. The CA Caribbean team is going to refine and improve the proposed RGA, and we're taking your comments and feedback and so on into account. The document is open for suggestions and feedback up until probably I would say the 3rd week or 4th week in October, and we're hoping to formally launch this regional goal on adaptation in late October, early November, and through online virtual webinar, and we're also going to publish it online as well, the technical paper. And moving forward, the proposed RGA will require local, national, regional buy-in and ownership, and also endorsement to be fully operationalized. So as I said, this is a proposal. And once we define, this is what the vision is, these are what the targets and purpose and so on are, then the next steps is to get greater buy-in and endorsement and see how we can move towards implementation. So I know people ask questions, where is this going to be housed? Who is going to be reviewing progress and so on? And I think these are discussions we will be having with governments and regional entities and so on. So my hope is that the regional goal on adaptation, when it's endorsed, because I hope that it's endorsed at the regional level at the CARICOM heads of government meeting, so it becomes now a regional policy. And I'm hoping that a regional organization, for example, the 5 Cs, could look at housing this and tracking progress on the goals. And definitely another conversation will have to be had with these organizations on looking at how is it going to be financed and what is the responsibilities and so on. But these are just some suggestions. This could always change, but it's just to say that this is just a proposal, and the next steps is that we need endorsement and buy-in, and then we need to look at where it's going to be housed and how it's going to be implemented. So any suggestions from participants will be greatly appreciated, and how to look at collaborations and so on is quite useful to help us inform how we plan to get this from it just being a proposal to it actually be happening. Yeah, so thanks so much. And I will stop sharing my screen now so I can actually start looking at the chat. And if you have any comments or questions and so on, feel free.
Great. Thank you very much, Sasha. So we are at time. I can give just 1 or 2 minutes in case there are any burning questions or suggestions before we wrap up. Okay.
At all the comments. So thank you so much for that. And yes, definitely, I will be following up with Dr. Trotz on how we could, refine the RGA and see how it could get, endorsement and how it could be operationalized. So I'll be following up with you, Dr. Trotz.
Sure, please do.
Yes. And yes, we're looking at countries to champion this. I was hoping that we would have been able to launch this at Latin America and Caribbean Climate Week through a side event, but we unfortunately did not hear back from the organizers as yet. So we'll be doing a virtual webinar in late October, early November. And it will be open to everybody here, CSOs, governments, negotiators, AOSIS as well, to just share this is what we've done, and how this could inform negotiations at the upcoming COP28.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Sasha, and thank you very much to all of our participants today. We definitely had a great turnout and some very interesting discussion in the chat, and we thank you for your suggestions and feedback. And as Sasha said, Sasha will work to take those on board. As we mentioned in the beginning, we will be sharing the recording and these slides, so you can look out for that. And also, if you have not had access to the technical paper yet, please feel free to reach out to Sasha so that we can share that with you. Again, thank you very much, everyone. I think this was a very productive session. We are very grateful for your input, and we look forward to engaging with you on the RGA in the future. So with that, I think we are done. Have a great day, everyone.